December 22, 1944, the heart of the Ardennes Offensive. The forest was silent except for the hiss of snow on steel. A lone M4A3 Sherman sat motionless on a narrow road, its tracks frozen into ice, a faint trail of smoke rising from the engine deck. Inside, 5 men huddled for warmth, their breath fogging against cold metal. They had been hit by shrapnel. Nothing fatal, but enough to seize a fuel line and stop the tank in its tracks. Within the hour, headlights appeared through the swirling snow. A U.S. ordnance truck rumbled to a halt beside them. Mechanics jumped down, tools already in hand. Wrenches clattered, torches flared. There was no shouting, only quiet, methodical work. By dusk, the Sherman's engine roared back to life. Its commander climbed in, nodded once, and rolled forward toward the front. Less than a mile away, hidden beneath pine trees, a German Panther lay still, abandoned. Its gearbox shattered, oil frozen solid, beyond rescue. Its crew had walked east, leaving perfection to die in the cold. That winter, 2 machines told the story of 2 nations and 2 philosophies of war. By late 1942, the war in Europe had entered a new mechanical age. Armored divisions no longer relied on light reconnaissance tanks or early war improvisations. The battlefield had become an arena of steel giants. Germany had stunned the world with its armored blitzkrieg in 1940. But as the conflict dragged on, a quieter kind of superiority was emerging from the factories of the United States. In Detroit, mass production had reached an almost unbelievable rhythm. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant, the first of its kind in the world, produced a tank every 55 minutes at its wartime peak. Across the Atlantic, American tank crews were driving the M4A3 Sherman, a machine designed not as the best on paper, but as the one that could always fight again tomorrow. The U.S. Army's philosophy was rooted in practical engineering. They knew tanks would break down, be hit, or bogged in mud. What mattered was not invincibility, but recoverability. Parts had to fit across variants, repairs had to be quick, and maintenance had to be possible even under artillery fire. The M4A3, introduced in 1942 and refined through 1944, was the embodiment of that belief. It used the Ford GAA V8 engine, a robust, gasoline-powered machine originally derived from an aircraft engine. It could run on lower-grade fuels, start in cold weather, and be swapped out entirely in hours. U.S. mechanics trained for such replacements routinely. Tank engines were modular by design. Meanwhile, the German Armored Corps was pushing in the opposite direction. Their early Panzer III and I-4 models had been effective, but by 1943, they faced the challenge of Soviet T-34s and the growing power of Allied armor. In response, Germany turned to technological escalation. The Panther tank, introduced in 1943 after the Battle of Kursk, was meant to be the ultimate answer. Sloped armor. A high-velocity 75mm K40-2 K1 T2 gun, superior optics, and a sleek profile. On paper, it outclassed the Sherman in almost every category. But inside German workshops, a different reality was unfolding. The Panther's engineering was exquisite and excruciating. Its components were so finely machined that even slight misalignment could cause catastrophic failure. The final drive, the heart of its mobility, was prone to breakage under stress. Its transmission was delicate, demanding precision assembly that only Germany's dwindling supply of skilled labor could manage. Each Panther required thousands of man-hours to produce, and each breakdown demanded a specialized repair crew, often impossible to spare in retreating conditions. As the Reich's infrastructure crumbled under Allied bombing, replacement parts and transport became luxuries. Back in the U.S., an entirely different war machine was in motion. The Ordnance Department standardized everything, from bolts to engines to tools. American maintenance manuals were printed in tens of thousands, distributed across Europe and the Pacific. Tank crews were expected not just to fight, but to fix. The U.S. Army's motorized logistics system meant that spare parts traveled with the front line. A vast network of supply trucks, recovery vehicles, and mobile machine shops followed every division. By the time the M4A3 entered large-scale deployment in 1944, it was more than just a tank. It was a system, a component in a living, self-sustaining machine that stretched from Detroit's foundries to the hedgerows of Normandy. Germany's tanks, in contrast, were individually magnificent but strategically fragile. Their complexity became a liability the moment the front moved faster than their maintenance could keep up. In the war of design philosophies, the seeds of victory were already being forged, not on the battlefield, but in the blueprints and factories that made endurance more valuable than elegance. And as 1944 approached, that difference would begin to show on every road, every workshop, and every burning field in Europe. By 1944, the contrast between American and German armored philosophy had become unmistakable. On one side of Europe, the United States was supplying not only its own divisions, but also those of Britain, France, and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. On the other, Germany was struggling to replace tanks faster than they were being lost. The Panther, despite its fearsome battlefield presence, was cursed by its own design brilliance. Engineers at Mayen and Daimler-Benz had pushed the limits of precision manufacturing at a time when raw materials and skilled labor were vanishing. Aluminum, high-grade steel, and ball bearings, the essential elements of German machinecraft, were being pulverized daily by Allied bombers. The Panther's drivetrain, especially its fragile final drives, required the kind of machining tolerances achievable only in peacetime factories. By late 1944, that level of perfection was impossible. Panthers arriving at the front were sometimes defective straight from assembly, their components warped by rushed production and inadequate heat treatment. Even when the tanks worked perfectly, their complexity made them a logistical nightmare. Each vehicle contained hundreds of unique parts that could not be interchanged between models. Mechanics often had to wait weeks for replacements that never came. In field reports from the Eastern and Western fronts alike, German maintenance officers described entire units immobilized not by enemy fire, but by mechanical attrition. American forces faced no such paralysis. The Sherman was designed with a philosophy of modularity and interchangeability that bordered on industrial genius. A transmission from one variant could often be used in another. Field depots were stocked with standardized components: engines, road wheels, gearboxes, electrical harnesses, all shipped in numbered crates that could be installed by men with basic training. Wherever the U.S. Army advanced, mobile ordnance workshops followed. Mounted on trucks, these traveling factories could weld, machine, and fabricate nearly any part. Recovery teams equipped with M32 or M31 tank retrievers pulled damaged Shermans from battlefields, towing them back for repair rather than abandonment. Crews were trained to perform their own field maintenance, changing track links, patching armor, or replacing filters, often under fire. German recovery operations, in contrast, were perilous and rare. Fuel shortages, constant Allied air patrols, and inadequate recovery vehicles meant that many damaged Panthers had to be destroyed to prevent capture. Photographs from 1944 show dozens of abandoned Panthers littering roadsides, often intact except for a mechanical failure. Each one represented weeks of lost labor and irreplaceable material. But beyond hardware, there was a deeper distinction, a difference in how each nation perceived the purpose of war machinery. The United States viewed tanks as consumable tools within an industrial ecosystem. Germany viewed them as masterpieces of craftsmanship, almost artisanal in nature. The U.S. could lose a Sherman and replace it within days. Germany could build a Panther that might outgun and outlast its rival, but not replace it fast enough to matter. This industrial philosophy extended far beyond tanks. American logistics embraced redundancy. Fuel convoys, spare parts, repair depots, even pre-packed meals were designed for continuous replacement. Every piece of the American war machine was meant to move, repair, and renew itself. The Army's motor pool culture ensured that every driver, every mechanic, every tanker understood maintenance as part of survival. In contrast, the German system depended on expertise that was vanishing as the war consumed its youth. By 1944, many repair units were filled with untrained conscripts or foreign laborers. Workshops lacked parts, tools, and power. The German logistical command, stretched thin by both the Eastern Front and Allied bombing, could not deliver even the essentials to the front lines. When the Allies landed in Normandy, the disparity became irreversible. As Shermans rolled inland, mechanics followed closely behind. Tanks that threw a track or burned a clutch were back in service within a day. Panthers that broke down in hedgerow country often had to be blown up by their own crews. And so, as the war reached its final year, the question of which tank was better no longer mattered. The true contest lay in which army could keep its machines alive. And in that war of endurance, America's engineering pragmatism was already winning. From Normandy to the Ardennes, the lesson was clear. No weapon, no matter how powerful, could survive without the system that sustained it. And soon, in the frozen forests of Belgium, that truth would be tested in the harshest conditions of the war. The U.S. Army's tank crews learned early that survival was not just about firepower, it was about function. A tank that could be repaired was a tank that could return fire the next day. The M4A3 Sherman, while often criticized for its thinner armor and less powerful gun compared to its German rivals, carried an advantage invisible on the battlefield but decisive behind the lines: maintainability. In the motor pools of northern France and Belgium, repairmen worked like surgeons. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. Most never fired a weapon in anger. But they were the reason armored divisions could keep advancing. Their world was one of grease, noise, and timing. Long nights under tarpaulins, welding sparks flickering against the winter dark. Every component of the M4A3 was designed with these men in mind. The Ford GAA V8 engine was a marvel of American simplification. Powerful, standardized, and accessible. It could be swapped out in hours using a crane and a few men. Mechanics joked that if a Sherman threw a rod before breakfast, it could be running again by lunch. This speed of recovery was not an accident. It was the result of a national design philosophy, born from Henry Ford's assembly lines and codified by the U.S. Army Ordnance Department. American factories produced tanks not as individual weapons, but as interchangeable components of a vast mechanical organism. Bolts, fittings, electrical cables, filters, all followed the same standard dimensions. Even different manufacturers, like Chrysler, Ford, and Fisher Body, built parts that fit each other's machines seamlessly. Training matched the machinery. Every armored unit included ordnance detachments who could diagnose problems, requisition parts, and carry out full rebuilds in the field. Manuals were written in plain language and illustrated with diagrams for every repair imaginable, from replacing a differential to patching a fuel line. Soldiers called it the Bible of the Sherman, but the real genius was mobility. American logistics officers, veterans of the Red Ball Express, and other high-speed supply routes ensured that no tank went long without help. Entire convoys were dedicated to moving spare engines, transmissions, and ammunition to the front. In workshops scattered across liberated Europe, new Shermans rolled off ships and were modified overnight for specific missions. Flamethrowers, bulldozers, or bridge layers before being driven straight to the battlefield. The result was continuity. A damaged Sherman might leave the line for a day or two, but rarely longer. Crews often returned to fight in the same vehicle, patched with new armor plates or painted with improvised camouflage. To them, the tank became more than a machine. It was a companion that could take punishment and keep coming back. This reliability fostered morale. Soldiers trusted the Sherman because they trusted the system behind it. In the words of one 4th Armored Division mechanic, "The Germans built theirs to be perfect. We built ours to be fixed." Even senior commanders recognized that advantage. General Patton frequently emphasized repair and recovery as the soul of mobility. He ordered maintenance depots to move with the pace of the front, ensuring that mechanical casualties never slowed momentum. His armored columns in France advanced at such speed that German intelligence assumed they were operating multiple divisions, unaware that U.S. tanks were being repaired and refueled almost as quickly as they were hit. By late 1944, the M4A3 had become a symbol of American practicality, the machine that refused to die. Its armor could be pierced, its gun could be outmatched, but its heart, that engine, that network of repair, that philosophy of endurance, kept it rolling across every field from Normandy to Bastogne. And for every Sherman that rose again, a German Panther somewhere nearby lay silent, its power locked behind engineering brilliance too complex for war's chaos. For German tank crews, the Panther was both a source of pride and a burden. It was fast on paper, deadly in ambush, and visually imposing, the product of a nation obsessed with mechanical excellence. But beneath its graceful lines and sloped armor lay a fragile secret. It was a masterpiece that could not survive its own perfection. When the Panther entered service in 1943, it stunned Allied intelligence. Its armor was nearly impenetrable from the front, and its 70mm KWK-42 gun could knock out a Sherman at ranges where the American crews could barely see the target. In early battles such as Kursk, the tank seemed to confirm Germany's engineering dominance. Yet those same operations exposed the flaw that would haunt it to the war's end. Its machinery was too delicate. For the battlefield, it was built to rule. The Panther's final drive and transmission were its Achilles heel. Both systems were crafted with precision tolerances suitable for laboratory assembly lines, not muddy fields or hasty wartime repairs. Overheating, gear slippage, and mechanical seizure were constant threats. Reports from the Eastern Front describe Panthers immobilized after only a few kilometers of movement, their engines crippled by dust, ice, or overstrain. In theory, these faults could be corrected if spare parts and time were available. But Germany had neither. By late 1944, its industry was fractured by Allied bombing, its fuel reserves evaporating, and its transport system collapsing. Each Panther required over 150,000 skilled man-hours to build, and almost as many to keep running. In practice, every loss was permanent. Field mechanics faced a nightmare. Spare gearboxes and final drives were rare, and even when available, replacing them required equipment and conditions impossible near the front. Unlike the Sherman, which could be stripped and reassembled by a small team, the Panther demanded specialized cranes and trained technicians. Many were left to rust where they broke down. Crew morale suffered as a result. Soldiers who once admired the Panther's gun and armor came to distrust its reliability. In interviews after the war, several German tank commanders admitted they would have preferred a simpler machine. One recalled bitterly, "Our tanks could kill anything, except their own mechanical problems." The logistical contrast to the Americans was devastating. U.S. units could request spare parts directly from forward depots, and trucks would arrive within hours. German units relied on fragmented supply lines that stretched through bombed railways and overrun depots. A tank disabled by a broken drive sprocket might wait weeks for a part that never came. The psychological weight of this reality was immense. Crews knew that a single mechanical failure could mean not just the end of a mission, but the end of their survival. Abandonment became routine. German tactical reports from the Ardennes and the Eastern Front repeatedly list mechanical failure as the reason for tank losses, sometimes more than enemy fire. Even the Panthers' strengths worked against it. Its high-velocity gun demanded premium ammunition, often unavailable. Its heavy armor strained its suspension, consuming fuel at a rate Germany could no longer sustain. And while the Sherman's gasoline engine could run on nearly any Allied fuel stock, the Panther's Maybach engine required refined gasoline in short supply. In the end, the Panther became a symbol not of German power, but of its overreach, a triumph of design that faltered in practice. As one captured mechanic told Allied interrogators in 1945, the Panther was perfect. Too perfect for war. That perfection would soon meet its reckoning, as the winter of 1944 brought the two machines face to face in the Ardennes. By December 1944, the war in Europe had reached its final act, and nowhere was its outcome more visibly written in steel than in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble, a desperate thrust through Belgium intended to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp. It would also become the final trial for both the U.S. M4A3 Sherman and the German Panther. In the frozen forests around Bastogne, the contrast between the two machines and the systems that sustained them could not have been sharper. German armored spearheads, built around the feared Panzer Lehr Division and the 1st SS Panzer Corps, fielded dozens of Panthers. They looked unstoppable as they rolled through fog and snow, engines rumbling across icy roads. But even before they reached the front, mechanical attrition began to devour their strength. Panther after Panther broke down in the opening days of the offensive. Final drives shattered under the stress of climbing the steep, frozen hills. Transmissions seized in the cold. Crews were forced to abandon vehicles still intact, too heavy to tow, too complex to repair, and too far from supply depots. For every tank that reached the front line, one or two were left behind. Meanwhile, the American 4th Armored Division, part of Patton's Third Army, was pushing north at a relentless pace. Shermans churned through snow and mud, their engines coughing in the cold but never stopping. Maintenance crews traveled close behind, working day and night from the backs of trucks or under makeshift shelters of canvas and corrugated steel. When a Sherman threw a track, the crew stayed with it. When the engine froze, mechanics replaced it on site. Replacement parts arrived within hours, sometimes dropped by air when roads were blocked. Each repaired tank meant another gun in the line, another chance to resist the German advance. On December 23rd, U.S. armor broke through to Bastogne, relieving the surrounded 101st Airborne Division. It was a feat of endurance as much as courage. Reports from the 4th Armored Division's Ordnance Company show that nearly 70% of the tanks entering that push had undergone some form of field repair in the previous week. Engines, transmissions, even entire turrets had been swapped in snowbound workshops under enemy shell fire. The Germans, watching from frozen ridgelines, were stunned by how quickly the Americans seemed to recover. A Panther commander from the 2nd Panzer Division recorded in his logbook, "We destroy one, and by dawn they are back." The same tanks, it seems, returned from the dead. The secret was no mystery to those who understood logistics. The Americans didn't rely on miracles, they relied on organization. Each armored division operated as a self-contained ecosystem. Fuel convoys, ordnance battalions, recovery vehicles, and trained mechanics moved as one living organism. The Panther divisions, by contrast, were magnificent but brittle, designed for a blitzkrieg that no longer existed. By the end of December, the Panther's reputation for reliability had collapsed entirely. German records indicate that during the height of the Ardennes Offensive, as many as half of all Panthers were lost not to Allied fire, but to mechanical failure or fuel shortages. And when Allied counterattacks began in January 1945, the Panther, once the hunter, became the hunted. For every German tank destroyed, the Americans brought 2 repaired Shermans back to life. It was not superiority of armor or firepower that won that winter. It was the ability to endure. The battlefield had proven the truth engineers on both sides already knew. Perfection was powerful, but reliability was invincible. As January 1945 dawned, the snow-covered fields of the Ardennes were littered with the frozen remains of Germany's last hope. Panthers lay scattered along roadsides, some burned out, others perfectly intact but lifeless, their tracks sunk deep into ruts of ice and mud. The offensive had consumed fuel, men, and machinery faster than Germany could replace them. In the towns retaken by the Allies, American recovery crews moved methodically. Bulldozers cleared paths through the wreckage, while M31 recovery tanks hauled damaged Shermans back toward mobile depots. Inside the heated canvas tents of ordnance units, engines were stripped, cleaned, and reassembled. The air smelled of oil, gasoline, and burnt metal, the scent of American industrial persistence. By contrast, the German tank units were unraveling. The Panther's strengths had turned into liabilities. Its wide tracks and heavy suspension struggled in the thick Ardennes mud. Its high-velocity gun required ammunition so carefully machined that supply depots often ran dry. Fuel convoys, constantly harassed by Allied fighter bombers, never arrived. The Panzerlehr and 2nd Panzer Divisions fought bravely, but could not sustain momentum. In one report dated January 10, 1945, a German commander noted that only 12 of his 48 Panthers were operational, the rest immobilized or awaiting repairs that would never come. The Americans, meanwhile, were moving faster than ever. Patton's armored columns pressed eastward, using Shermans that had been repaired just days earlier. Entire engines replaced on the roadside. Transmissions swapped in frozen barns. The U.S. Army had turned improvisation into doctrine. Every tank restored to service became a silent victory over attrition itself. In the skies above, Allied air superiority ensured that even damaged Shermans could be recovered without fear of strafing. German repair crews were not so lucky. The moment a Panther was spotted being towed, fighter bombers descended in minutes, reducing both the vehicle and its support column to wreckage. The Luftwaffe, once a shield, was now powerless. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. During the Ardennes campaign, German armored forces lost more than 600 Panthers and Tigers, many abandoned intact. American losses were comparable in raw numbers, but over 70% of damaged Shermans were repaired and returned to combat within 2 weeks. The ratio was decisive. In those same weeks, something intangible shifted among American crews. They began to realize that their true weapon was not the gun of the Sherman, nor even its engine. It was the system behind them. Mechanics and drivers, tank commanders and engineers, all bound together by a logistical network unmatched in the war. For the Germans, that realization came too late. Even their most talented engineers, now operating under constant bombardment, could only watch as their precision-built machines succumbed to neglect. The once proud factories of Kassel, Nuremberg, and Augsburg were silent ruins. Replacement parts existed only on paper. A Panther knocked out in the Ardennes often became a landmark, too heavy to move, too complex to save. Soldiers from both sides would pass by its hulking frame, its long barrel pointing aimlessly toward the sky, and understand what it symbolized: not defeat by firepower, but defeat by exhaustion. The mechanical duel of 1944 had ended not with explosions, but with silence. One side still moving, the other standing still. And in that silence, as the Shermans rolled east toward the Rhine, the war's outcome was no longer in question. The tank that could be repaired in hours had outlasted the one that could burn for days. By the spring of 1945, Europe was a continent of wreckage. Burned-out vehicles lined every major road from the Ardennes to the Rhine. But among them, a pattern was unmistakable. Rows of German Panthers and Tigers, abandoned in ditches, bridges, and forests, often without a single shell hole in their armor. American troops who advanced through Germany noted this strange sight again and again. The hulking silhouettes of the Reich's wonder weapons lay scattered, engines missing, hatches open, their guns still clean. Many had been destroyed by their own crews, not from enemy fire, but from mechanical failure or the absence of fuel, the U.S. Army's post-war European theater of operations. Equipment survey found that nearly half of all German tanks lost in late 1944 and early 1945 were self-abandoned due to breakdown or supply collapse. In contrast, the U.S. Army's Ordnance Service had recovered and repaired tens of thousands of damaged vehicles, many within days of being hit. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the contrast between the two war machines was absolute. The Germans had built masterpieces, tanks that embodied precision and engineering ambition. The Americans had built instruments of endurance, machines meant not to impress, but to survive. The Sherman was never the best tank on paper. It was the tank that stayed on the battlefield. When one broke, it was towed, repaired, and returned. When a Panther broke, it was often left behind, too delicate, too demanding, too irreplaceable. In the words of U.S. General Omar Bradley, "The Germans built a few good tanks. We built many good ones, and that's why we won." Behind those numbers was a network of effort, the unsung hands of ordnance crews, engineers, and drivers who kept the Army's heart beating. A study conducted by the U.S. Army in 1946 showed that 81% of Shermans knocked out during combat were recoverable. Of those, nearly 65% rejoined combat within 3 weeks. The same was true for every level of maintenance. Mobile depots trailed divisions by mere miles, carrying parts, tools, and fuel. A U.S. Army battalion could receive replacement road wheels, engines, and transmissions within hours. Even ammunition shipments followed predictable, almost rhythmic patterns, a luxury Germany had long since lost. For the Wehrmacht, the logistical collapse became terminal. Rail networks were bombed daily. Bridges were destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Fuel trains never arrived. The few surviving repair depots worked by candlelight, cannibalizing one tank to fix another, and still falling behind. German tank crews began referring to their Panthers bitterly as diva machines, powerful, temperamental, and hopelessly high maintenance. Many veterans later admitted they would have traded their Panther for a Sherman if it meant fuel, reliability, and support. When the U.S. Army pushed toward Berlin, the M4A3's mechanical dependability became the engine of inevitability. The same tank that had fought in Normandy, then in the Ardennes, now rolled through German towns, still carrying the scars of past battles. But alive. The Panther's story ended in fields and forests, frozen in time. The Sherman's story kept moving, one repaired machine at a time, until it reached victory. And yet, the aftermath was not just about machines. It was about what those machines revealed, the philosophies that built them, and the human systems that sustained them. Because behind every Sherman that roared back to life was a nation that believed in momentum over perfection. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, U.S. Army investigators walked through captured depots and workshops. What they found shocked even seasoned officers. In one facility near Kassel, hundreds of Panther hulls stood in rows, half-finished, some without engines, others awaiting final assembly. Fuel shortages had paralyzed production months earlier. Crates of precision components sat untouched, covered in dust. Every piece was finely crafted. but none were simple enough to replace in the field. A few miles away, a U.S. Ordnance inspection team examined a Panther that had been abandoned intact. Its transmission had failed after less than 150 kilometers of movement. The mechanics who studied it noted that the gearbox alone contained over 400 machined parts, many requiring skilled hand-fitting. Rebuilding it in combat conditions was practically impossible. By contrast, the M4A3 Sherman's transmission could be swapped in under 6 hours using field tools. That difference, 6 hours versus 6 days, was not a matter of design elegance, but of doctrine. Germany had designed its tanks as weapons. America had designed its tanks as tools of a system. And that system, built on logistics, discipline, and adaptability, proved unstoppable. When the U.S. Army demobilized in late 1945, its records showed staggering numbers. Over 49,000 Sherman tanks produced. Nearly 1 million spare parts kits distributed to field units. Thousands of trained mechanics, not just in factories, but on the front lines. Every bolt, every wrench, every crate of oil told the same story. That industrial power had become a weapon in itself. German generals, interviewed after the war, were blunt in their conclusions. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, admitted, "Our panzers fought bravely, but the Americans fought with an army of mechanics. They always returned." Other captured officers spoke of the same realization. They described their frustration watching U.S. tanks reappear days after being knocked out, patched and painted, while their own Panthers lay scattered like monuments to a doomed perfectionism. The irony was bitter. The Panther had been conceived as a counter to the Soviet T-34, a symbol of German technological pride. Yet by war's end, it was the American philosophy, not the German, that truly mirrored the T-34's strength, simplicity, serviceability, and scale. Even after the war, the legacy of this contrast endured. The M4A3 remained in service across the world for decades, in Korea, in the Middle East, in training fields and arsenals far from Europe. The Panther, meanwhile, faded into museums and scrapyards, admired but impractical, too complex to sustain. In military academies, the comparison became a lesson, not just in engineering, but in thinking. A tank was never only a machine. It was a reflection of the army that built it and the nation that maintained it. By 1945, the American Army had learned that lesson perfectly. It wasn't about having the strongest machine. It was about having the machine that could keep fighting. And in that truth lay the silent power of the Sherman, the tank that always came back. The war had ended. The engines had cooled. But the sound of those field wrenches, turning, tightening, repairing, lingered long after the guns went quiet. In the end, the story of the Sherman was not about brilliance. It was about endurance. It was the quiet triumph of practicality over perfection, of 1,000 steady hands over a single elegant idea. Germany's Panther had been an engineer's dream. Fast, deadly, meticulously crafted. But it demanded a kind of war Germany could no longer sustain. A war of uninterrupted production, of infinite fuel, of untouchable factories. By 1944, none of those existed. America's M4A3, by contrast, was born from a different philosophy. That wars are not won by flawless machines, but by machines that can be repaired, refueled, and replaced. It was the embodiment of American logistics, the reflection of a nation that built its weapons to serve the soldier, not the engineer. For every Panther that burned out and was left behind, there was a Sherman that limped back, patched, refueled, and returned to fight another day, each one a moving symbol of an industrial army that refused to stop. When historians look back, they see more than a battle between two tanks. They see two ways of thinking. One obsessed with perfection, the other devoted to persistence. The Panther taught the world what power could look like. The Sherman taught it what power could endure. And as the war faded into memory, those who lived it remembered not the machines that broke, but the ones that always came back. The rumble of the M4A3 in the cold, steady as the march of victory itself.